Good evening. My name is Ben Tafoya, and tonight's the first session of what I'm calling 5 o'clock macro. 5 o'clock macro is an opportunity for me to share some of my expertise and interest in macroeconomics with folks through YouTube. Given the significant issues that have developed as a result of the coronavirus and attendant economic consequences of the worldwide shutdown of economic activity. I'll be trying to do a series of these talks at 5 o'clock each night to bring you this information. Tonight we're getting underway. I have an interest in these issues as a result of both my educational background and professional activities. I have a doctorate from Northeastern University, where I teach as an adjunct lecturer economics, both macro and micro, and have my undergraduate degree in economics from Georgetown University. Active as an academic and practitioner in sort of the political economy of public administration. I write a column for the American Society for Public Administration. I just had a book chapter published on social equity and public administration. And all of that's activities in addition to my full-time job as a director of a research group here in Boston, where I reside in a suburb. The real impetus for this is the concern about what's happening now with the macroeconomy. And as we consider how this crisis is different from the last in terms of the macroeconomic effect. What do we mean when we talk about a macroeconomic effect? How do we measure the drop in economic activity that results from these extraordinary actions that have occurred? And what can we do to lessen the impact on the global economy and the economy here in the U.S. of the extraordinary measures we've had to take to protect the public health and welfare of our citizenry? When will the economy be back to normal? How would we measure that? And overall, through this crisis, what's the impacts of concerns such as economic inequality, as well as racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination in our societies? What's the impact of nationalism on the economic foundations of our societies as we move forward facing the challenges presented by the coronavirus crisis? And where can we go to learn more about all of these topics? So these presentations that I'll do each evening will be broken up into roughly two 15-minute segments. They will cover various topics, which we'll get to in a minute. But fundamentally, where I want to get to is that in 2007 to 2009, the U.S. suffered a very severe recession. And that recession was basically caused by the over-financialization of the housing market. And when housing prices started to decline, when the bubble burst in the housing market, there was an adverse impact on the holders of the sort of excessive amounts of bonds that were created by financial institutions that helped to tank the economy. We saw a significant decline in housing and other areas of investment, short-term collapse in consumption, steep rise in unemployment, and that economic collapse created a hole in our economy, a hole in demand. And that hole needed to be filled by government action. There were two types of government action undertaken. There was a very modest stimulus that was launched in 2009, which involved the introduction of a variety of programs that we'll talk about later on in the series. But it also involved a significant and ongoing rounds of monetary policy directed by the Federal Reserve that helped inject liquidity into the economy with the stated goal of helping to stabilize the banking system and financial services industry. And that unprecedented level of financial intervention by the Federal Reserve did help a large number of significantly sized banking institutions survive that economic displacement. But as we know, the economic recovery from that last recession was long and slow, and has recently come to an abrupt end because of the crisis related to the coronavirus. And this particular economic catastrophe was created basically by the fact that the government shut down large sectors of the economy in order to protect the public from this very dangerous virus, which has taken a couple 100,000 lives worldwide as we search for a cure and implement proper kinds of testing. And so we've engaged in social isolation, closed restaurants, shops, stopped people from going to their offices to work. Here in Massachusetts, we have grocery stores open, pharmacies open, construction projects moving ahead, and many of us, like myself, working from home during this extraordinary period. But the sum total of all that is significant parts of the economy are not in operation, and that will lead to high levels of unemployment that we've already glimpsed, and a significant lessening of GDP, gross domestic product. So I want to be able to sort of go through all of this as I would if I was actively teaching macroeconomics this semester. These would be the kinds of ideas that I'd be talking about with students and illustrating sort of the fundamental concept behind macro with these real-world events. As we get started, there are a couple of ideas that I want to introduce from the sort of generalized study of economics. And when we talk about and teach macro, we typically start with some fundamental concepts of economics from micro, and there are a few ideas that I want to make sure that folks are aware of if they haven't had an opportunity to study the topic. And the first is this idea of diminishing marginal returns. And what we mean by that is, as humans, the more that we're exposed to a particular thing that we like, some capability of satisfying a desire, the more of it that we have, at some point, the marginal utility of that item declines such that the cost is in excess of what it is that we could possibly get from the experience. So a simple example that I use teaching class is I teach at night, so our classes typically start at 5:50 p.m. Many of us are hungry, so I ask students if they're hungry, and I use either an example of pizza or a bar of chocolate, and I ask students to raise their hand if they're hungry. Number always do, so I'll call on somebody and say, hey, so if I had a delicious premium bar of chocolate right now, how much money would you offer to me in exchange for the bar of chocolate? They'd say something like, oh, $10. I'd give you $10 for one right now. And I said, great. What if I had two? How much would you be willing to give me for that second bar of chocolate? And they would indicate that they would be willing to maybe give me $5 for that second bar of chocolate. And then I asked them, well, what about a third bar of chocolate? How much are you interested in giving me for this third bar of chocolate? And they would look at me like, I'm not really interested. And I said, well, maybe $1. And they'd say, yeah, something like that. And so charting this on the board, like the graphic on the display, indicates that over time, sort of a single consumer's interest in that bar of chocolate declines, which means that in order to sell more of the chocolate, we would have to offer a significantly lower price for the subsequent units, meaning that when it comes to chocolate, we do have a satisfaction limit at any given moment, and perhaps then we'd be interested in other items that would, for the money, offer us a greater degree of satisfaction. So what we would do in the sort of simple model that we use is we would introduce, say, a second good, and we would discuss the relative trade-off between, say, pizza and chocolate, and how much money people would have to allocate to their consumption of the goods, what we refer to as a budget constraint, and how it would get allocated based on a budget constraint of, say, $100 a month for chocolate and pizza, and that the trade-off would be, say, $10 for a bar of chocolate and $10 for a large pizza, and everyone would have sort of different ways that they would allocate that money given $100 a month, but you can't go beyond that potential allocation of chocolate and pizza because of your budgetary constraint. The only way the budgetary constraint can be lifted is by generating additional income that would allow you to reorganize your expenditures such that you're able to spend more on both items. Now, as we teach economics, typically we use sort of simple models to communicate ideas, and those simple models can be extremely useful as we come to understand the workings of the economy, and as a sort of follow-on to the idea of diminishing marginal return, we move on to then a simple matter model of supply and demand.